Judge Richard Pemberton looked at his gold watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He was standing outside Magnolia's restaurant in downtown, and he was not happy. The wind was cold, and he pulled his expensive coat tighter around his body. Richard was a man who did not like to wait for anything or anyone. Richard was 58 years old and had been a judge for 15 years. People in the courthouse knew him as a strict man who followed rules. He had gray hair that was always perfectly combed, and he wore expensive suits every day. Today he was wearing his favorite black suit with a red tie. His shoes were so shiny that they reflected the streetlights. The restaurant looked busy through the big glass windows. Richard could see people sitting at tables talking and laughing. Waiters were moving around with plates of food. The place looked fancy with its white tablecloths and soft lighting. This was exactly the kind of restaurant where Richard liked to eat. Tonight was important for Richard. He was meeting 3 other judges for dinner. They were going to talk about a big case that was coming up next month. Richard wanted everything to be perfect. He had chosen this restaurant because he heard it was one of the best in the city. Richard looked at his watch again. It was 7:15 and his dinner was supposed to start at 7 o'clock. He did not like being late, and he especially did not like when other people made him late. His face was getting red with anger. A young couple walked past him and went straight into the restaurant. Richard watched them go inside without waiting. This made him even more angry. Why were they getting in before him? He had made a reservation weeks ago. Richard walked to the front door and pulled it open. The warm air from inside hit his face, and he could smell delicious food cooking. The restaurant was full of people talking and enjoying their meals. Soft music was playing in the background. He looked around for someone to help him. Near the front door was a small desk with a sign that said, "Please wait to be seated." Richard stood behind the sign and waited. He tapped his foot on the floor and looked around with an angry expression. The restaurant was beautiful inside. The walls were painted a warm yellow color, and there were paintings of flowers hanging everywhere. Each table had a small lamp that gave off soft light. The chairs looked comfortable and expensive. Richard could see why this place was popular. But where was someone to seat him? Richard looked around and saw several people in black uniforms moving around the restaurant. They all looked busy carrying plates and taking orders from customers. No one seemed to notice him standing by the front desk. Richard cleared his throat loudly. Still, no one came over to help him. He was getting more and more frustrated. In the courtroom, people jumped when he spoke. Here he was being ignored like he was nobody special. A waiter walked past carrying a tray full of drinks. Richard tried to get his attention. "Excuse me," he said in a loud voice. But the waiter did not stop. He kept walking to a table in the back of the restaurant. Richard felt his face getting hot with anger. This was not how things were supposed to go. He was Judge Richard Pemberton. People were supposed to treat him with respect. He was not used to being treated like this. He looked at his watch again. 7:20. His guests would be arriving soon, and he did not even have a table yet. What would they think if they arrived and found him still standing by the door like some common person? Richard had worked hard his whole life to get where he was. He grew up in a wealthy family and went to the best schools. He graduated from law school at the top of his class. He had been a successful lawyer before becoming a judge. People knew his name and respected him. In his courtroom, everything happened exactly when and how he wanted it to. Lawyers stood when he entered the room. Everyone called him Your Honor. No one dared to keep him waiting. That was the way things should be. But here in this restaurant, he was just another customer waiting for a table. Richard did not like this feeling at all. He was used to being important, used to being treated like someone special. Another couple walked through the front door and stood behind Richard. They were young and dressed casually in jeans and sweaters. Richard turned around and looked at them with disapproval. These people did not look like they belonged in such a fancy restaurant. Finally, Richard saw a young woman in a black uniform walking toward the front desk. She had a smile on her face and moved with confidence. She looked to be in her 20s, much younger than Richard. She was a black woman with her hair pulled back neatly. Richard felt a moment of relief. Finally, someone was coming to help him. But as he looked at the young woman more closely, he began to have doubts. She looked so young. Did she really know how to handle important customers like him? The young woman approached the desk with a friendly smile. She picked up a menu and looked at Richard with bright, welcoming eyes. "Good evening," she said in a warm voice. Welcome to Magnolia's. How many people will be in your party tonight? Richard looked down at her with a stern expression. He was much taller than she was, and he used his height to try to make her feel small. I have a reservation, he said in a cold voice. The name is Pemberton. Judge Pemberton. The young woman nodded and looked down at a book on the desk. She ran her finger down a list of names. Yes, here it is, she said. A table for 4 at 7 o'clock. I apologize for the wait, Your Honor. We had a small delay in the kitchen, but your table is ready now. Richard was not satisfied with this answer. A delay? He said, raising his voice slightly. I do not appreciate being kept waiting. I am a very busy man with important responsibilities. The young woman continued to smile, but Richard could see that his words had made her uncomfortable. Good, he thought. She needed to understand who she was dealing with. I completely understand, Your Honor, she said politely. Let me take you to your table right away. I think you will be very happy with the location we have chosen for you. Richard followed her into the restaurant, but he was not finished expressing his displeasure. Tonight was just getting started, and he had already decided that this young woman was not capable of providing the level of service he expected and deserved. The young woman walked ahead of Richard through the busy restaurant. Her name tag said Maya, and she moved between the tables with practiced ease. Richard followed behind her, his sharp eyes taking in everything around him. He was looking for things to criticize. Maya led him to a corner table near a large window. The table was set with clean white plates, shiny silverware, and cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles. A small candle sat in the center, casting a warm glow across the table. Here is your table, Your Honor, Maya said, pulling out a chair for Richard. This is one of our best spots. You have a nice view of the city lights, and it is quiet enough for conversation. Richard did not sit down right away. Instead, he looked around the table with a critical eye. He checked the cleanliness of the silverware by holding a fork up to the light. He ran his finger along the edge of the table to see if there was any dust. Maya watched him with a patient smile, but inside she was starting to feel nervous. She had been working in restaurants for 8 years, and she knew the signs of a difficult customer. This man was going to be trouble. The table seems acceptable, Richard said finally, as if he was doing Maya a great favor. He sat down in the chair she had pulled out for him. However, I want you to know that I expect perfect service tonight. I am meeting with very important people, and I cannot have any mistakes. Of course, Your Honor, Maya replied. We always strive to provide excellent service to all our guests. Can I start you with something to drink while you wait for your party? Richard looked at Maya with doubt in his eyes. She seemed friendly enough, but she looked so young. How could someone her age possibly understand what kind of service he required? In his experience, young people today did not have the same work ethic as his generation. Do you have any experience serving high-profile customers? Richard asked bluntly. I am not sure someone of your background would understand the level of attention my table requires. Maya felt a sting from his words, but she kept her professional smile in place. She had heard comments like this before from customers who made assumptions about her based on her age and race. It never got easier, but she had learned how to handle it. I have been working in fine dining for several years, Maya answered calmly. I am very familiar with providing attentive service to all types of guests. I would be happy to take care of your table tonight. Richard was not convinced. Several years? He repeated with a skeptical tone. How old are you? You look like you just got out of high school. This question made Maya uncomfortable, but she continued to remain professional. I am 26 years old, Your Honor. I have been working in restaurants since I was 18. Richard shook his head slowly. 26, he muttered. When I was 26, I was already practicing law. Young people today seem to lack ambition. They are content to stay in entry-level jobs instead of making something of themselves. Maya felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed this job, and she could not afford to lose her temper with a customer, no matter how rude he was being. Perhaps I could get someone more experienced to serve your table, Maya offered, hoping to make the situation easier for both of them. No, Richard said quickly. I want to see if you can handle it. Consider this a test of your abilities, but I am warning you now I have very high standards, and I will not hesitate to speak to your manager if you disappoint me. Just then, Richard saw 3 men in expensive suits walking through the restaurant toward their table. These were his dinner guests, Judge Harrison, Judge Martinez, and Judge Thompson. All three were successful men in their 50s, and Richard wanted to impress them. "Ah, here are my associates now," Richard said, standing up to greet his friends. "Remember what I said about perfect service." The three judges approached the table with warm smiles. They shook hands with Richard and exchanged greetings. Maya stood nearby, waiting for them to settle in so she could seat them properly. "Gentlemen, this is our server," Richard said, gesturing toward Maya with a dismissive wave. "I was just explaining to her that we expect excellent service tonight." Judge Harrison, a kind-looking man with a gray beard, smiled at Maya. "Good evening, young lady. Thank you for taking care of us tonight." Maya smiled back, grateful for his polite manner. "It is my pleasure. Let me help you all get seated." As the judges sat down, Richard continued to watch Maya with critical eyes. He noticed that she placed the napkins on their laps with professional skill. She filled their water glasses without being asked and made sure everyone was comfortable. "Now then," Richard said to his colleagues, "I hope you are all prepared for an excellent meal. I specifically chose this restaurant because of its reputation." Judge Martinez looked around appreciatively. "It certainly seems lovely. The atmosphere is very nice." "Yes," Richard agreed, "though I am not entirely convinced about the quality of the service staff." He glanced at Maya as he said this, making sure she could hear him. Maya pretended not to notice his comment and approached the table with menus. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Magnolia's. Can I tell you about our specials tonight?" "Please do," Judge Thompson said politely. Maya began describing the evening's special dishes with knowledge and enthusiasm. She explained how each dish was prepared and what ingredients were used. Her descriptions were detailed and professional, showing that she knew the menu well. Richard listened with growing irritation. He had expected Maya to stumble over the descriptions or show her inexperience. Instead, she seemed to know exactly what she was talking about. This did not fit with his assumption that she was just an uneducated young woman. "The salmon sounds delicious," Judge Harrison said when Maya finished. "How is it prepared?" Maya explained the cooking method and the sauce that came with the dish. She also suggested a wine that would pair well with the salmon. Richard interrupted her explanation. "Are you sure you know what you are talking about?" he asked rudely. "These sound like complicated dishes. Maybe you should get someone with more experience to explain them to us." The other judges looked uncomfortable with Richard's behavior. They could see that Maya clearly knew her job well. "I assure you, Your Honor, I am very familiar with our menu," Maya replied calmly. "I have tried all of our dishes and can answer any questions you might have." Richard was becoming more frustrated. This young woman was not backing down the way he expected. In his courtroom, people became nervous when he questioned them. But Maya remained calm and confident. "We shall see," Richard said ominously. "The real test will be whether you can actually provide the level of service we require. I suspect you will find it more challenging than you think." Maya nodded politely and asked if they were ready to order drinks. As she took their drink orders, Richard continued to watch her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake he could criticize. The evening was just beginning, and Richard had already decided that this young woman needed to be taught a lesson about respect and proper service. He had no idea that he was the one who would be learning a lesson before the night was over. Maya returned to the table carrying a tray with the judge's drinks. She had ordered a bourbon for Richard, wine for Judge Harrison and Judge Martinez, and sparkling water for Judge Thompson. She placed each drink carefully in front of the correct person, making sure not to spill even a drop. "Here are your beverages, gentlemen," Maya said with a smile. "Are you ready to place your dinner orders, or would you like a few more minutes to decide?" Richard picked up his bourbon and took a small sip. He made a face as if something was wrong with it. "This bourbon tastes watered down," he announced loudly. "I specifically ordered a premium brand, and this does not taste like quality liquor." Maya looked concerned. "I am so sorry, Your Honor. Let me get you a fresh drink right away." "Which brand would you prefer?" "I should not have to tell you which brands are premium," Richard replied sharply. "A good server should know these things without being told. This is exactly what I was worried about." The other judges exchanged uncomfortable glances. Judge Harrison had tasted his wine and found it perfectly fine. Judge Martinez was enjoying his drink as well. They could see that Richard was being unreasonably difficult. "Richard," Judge Thompson said quietly, "perhaps we should just focus on enjoying our evening together." But Richard was not interested in backing down. He was enjoying the feeling of power he had over Maya. In his daily life, he was used to being in control, and he liked making sure everyone around him knew who was in charge. Maya returned quickly with a new bourbon for Richard. This time she brought the bottle to the table to show him the label. "This is our top-shelf bourbon, Your Honor. I hope this meets your expectations." Richard took a sip of the new drink. It tasted exactly the same as the first one, but he was not going to admit that. "This is slightly better," he said grudgingly, "but it should have been correct the first time." "Of course, Your Honor, I apologize for the confusion," Maya said politely. "Are you ready to order your meals now?" The judges began giving their orders. Judge Harrison ordered the salmon that Maya had recommended earlier. Judge Martinez chose the steak, and Judge Thompson decided on the chicken dish. When it came time for Richard to order, he studied the menu for a long time, even though he had already decided what he wanted. "I am thinking about the lobster," Richard said slowly, "but I have very specific requirements for how it should be prepared. Do you think the kitchen can handle special instructions?" "Absolutely," Maya replied. "Our chef is very skilled and can accommodate special requests. What would you like me to tell them?" Richard began listing a series of complicated instructions for how he wanted his lobster cooked. He wanted the butter sauce on the side, the vegetables steamed but not too soft, and the potato prepared in a very specific way. Maya listened carefully and wrote down every detail. "Are you sure you got all of that?" Richard asked when he finished. "These instructions are quite complex. Maybe you should read them back to me to make sure you understood." Maya read back the instructions perfectly, not missing a single detail. Richard had hoped she would make a mistake, but she had been listening carefully and taking good notes. "Fine," Richard said, sounding disappointed. "We will see if the kitchen can actually follow those instructions correctly." As Maya walked away to place their orders, Richard turned to his colleagues. "You see what I mean about the service here? That girl has no idea what she is doing. I guarantee you there will be problems with our food." Judge Harrison frowned. "She seemed very professional to me, Richard. She took our orders accurately and was quite polite." "You are being too kind," Richard replied. "Young people today do not have the same work ethic we had when we were starting our careers. They expect everything to be handed to them without putting in the effort to really learn their jobs." Judge Martinez nodded toward Maya, who was speaking with another table across the restaurant.
"She appears to be doing fine with her other customers."
"Look how attentive she is being." Richard turned to look and saw Maya laughing with an elderly couple at another table. She was helping them choose a dessert and seemed to be enjoying her conversation with them. This made Richard even more annoyed. "She is probably just putting on an act," Richard said dismissively. "Some people can fool you with a friendly smile, but when it comes to real professionalism, they fall short." While they waited for their food, Richard continued to find things to complain about. When Maya refilled their water glasses, he said the water was too cold. When she brought fresh bread to the table, he complained that it was not warm enough. Every time Maya came to their table, Richard had some new criticism. The other judges were becoming embarrassed by Richard's behavior. They could see that Maya was doing her job well, and they felt sorry for the way Richard was treating her. But they did not want to argue with their colleague in public. Maya, meanwhile, was starting to feel the stress of dealing with Richard's constant complaints. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but Richard seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. Her other customers were easy to please and seemed happy with her service. Only Richard's table was causing problems. When the food finally arrived, Maya carefully placed each plate in front of the correct judge. The meals looked beautiful and smelled delicious. The chef had clearly put effort into making everything perfect. Richard looked down at his lobster with a critical eye. He cut off a small piece and tasted it slowly. The lobster was cooked perfectly and seasoned just right. The vegetables were steamed exactly as he had requested, and the potato was prepared according to his specifications. But Richard was not about to admit that the food was good. He had spent the entire evening complaining, and he felt like he needed to continue finding problems. "This lobster is overcooked," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I specifically asked for it to be prepared medium, and this is clearly overdone." Maya looked concerned. "I am so sorry, Your Honor. Would you like me to have the kitchen prepare a new one for you?" "No," Richard said dramatically. "By the time they cook a new lobster, everyone else will be finished eating. I suppose I will just have to suffer through this meal." Judge Thompson had tried a bite of his chicken and found it delicious. He could not understand why Richard was being so unreasonable. "My meal is excellent," he said, hoping to lighten the mood. "Mine is wonderful as well," agreed Judge Harrison. "The salmon is cooked perfectly." But Richard continued to pick at his food and make negative comments. He complained that the sauce was too thick, the vegetables were too salty, and the potato was too dry. Maya offered to fix each problem, but Richard refused every solution she suggested. Other customers in the restaurant were starting to notice the commotion at Richard's table. Some people were looking over with curious expressions, wondering why one customer was being so difficult, while everyone else seemed to be enjoying their meals. Maya could feel her professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of Richard's constant criticism. She had been working hard all evening to provide good service, but nothing she did seemed to satisfy this demanding customer. As the evening continued, Richard's behavior became more and more unreasonable. He was no longer just being picky about the service, he was being deliberately cruel. And Maya was starting to realize that no matter what she did, this man was determined to make her evening miserable. What Richard did not know was that his behavior was being watched, not just by other customers, but by people who knew the truth about who Maya really was. And very soon, Richard was going to learn that his assumptions about this young woman were completely wrong. As the main course continued, Richard's behavior grew worse. He seemed to be enjoying the power he felt he had over Maya. Every few minutes he would call her over to complain about something new. The salt was too strong, the lighting was too dim, his chair was uncomfortable. Nothing was right in Richard's world. Maya approached the table once again, this time to offer dessert menus. She had been patient all evening, but the constant criticism was wearing her down. Her smile was still professional, but the other judges could see the tiredness in her eyes. "Would you like to see our dessert menu?" Maya asked politely. "We have some wonderful options tonight, including a chocolate cake that our chef made fresh this afternoon." Before anyone else could answer, Richard cut in harshly. "Before we talk about dessert, I want to discuss the terrible service we have received tonight. This has been one of the worst dining experiences I have ever had." Judge Harrison looked uncomfortable. "Richard, I think our service has been quite good, actually." "You are being too polite," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "This young woman clearly does not understand what fine dining service should look like." He turned to Maya with a cold stare. "You have made mistakes all evening long. The drinks were wrong, the food was poorly prepared, and your attitude has been unprofessional." Maya felt her heart beating faster. She knew that none of his complaints were fair or accurate. She had provided the same quality service she gave to every table. "I am sorry you feel that way, Your Honor. Is there something specific I can do to improve your experience?" "It is too late for that," Richard replied loudly. Several people at nearby tables turned to look at the commotion. "The damage has been done. You have ruined what should have been an important business dinner." Judge Martinez tried to intervene. "Richard, perhaps we should lower our voices. People are starting to stare." But Richard was not interested in being quiet. He was enjoying the attention and the feeling of being in control. "Let them stare," he said. "Maybe other customers should know what kind of service they can expect here." Maya felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She would not let this man see her cry. "Your Honor, I have done my best to provide you with excellent service tonight. I am sorry if I have somehow failed to meet your expectations." "Your best is not good enough," Richard said cruelly. "This is exactly the problem with young people today. You think showing up and doing the minimum is sufficient. You have no idea what real professionalism looks like." The other judges were now clearly embarrassed by their colleagues' behavior. Judge Thompson looked around the restaurant and saw that many people were watching their table with disapproval. He could see that Richard was making a fool of himself. "Perhaps," Judge Thompson said carefully, "we should focus on finishing our meal and enjoying our evening together." Richard ignored his colleague's suggestion. He was on a roll now, and he did not want to stop. "No, I think this young woman needs to learn an important lesson tonight. She needs to understand that when you work in a service industry, you actually have to provide good service." Maya took a deep breath and tried one more time to diffuse the situation. "Your Honor, if there is anything specific that you would like me to do differently, I am happy to listen to your feedback." "What I would like," Richard said, standing up from his chair to make himself look more intimidating, "is for you to admit that you are not qualified for this job. You clearly do not have the skills or experience necessary to work in a restaurant of this caliber. The restaurant had become very quiet. Even tables far away from Richard's could hear his raised voice. Other customers were looking shocked and uncomfortable. Some people were shaking their heads in disapproval of Richard's behavior. I think, Richard continued, getting louder and more aggressive, that you should stick to working at fast food restaurants or diners. This kind of fine dining establishment requires servers who actually know what they are doing. Maya felt a flash of anger, but she controlled herself. She had worked too hard to get where she was to let one rude customer destroy her composure. I understand you are unhappy with your experience tonight, Your Honor. Perhaps it would be best if I got our manager to speak with you. Yes, Richard said triumphantly. Get your manager. I want to file a formal complaint about your performance. I want to make sure that appropriate action is taken to prevent other customers from having to deal with this kind of incompetence. Judge Harrison had heard enough. He stood up and placed his hand on Richard's arm. Richard, I think you need to calm down. You are making a scene, and it is embarrassing. Richard shook off his colleague's hand. I am not embarrassed. I am standing up for what is right. This girl needs to learn that there are consequences for poor performance. What consequences? Asked a new voice from behind Richard. He turned around to see a well-dressed Hispanic man in his 40s approaching their table. The man was wearing a crisp white shirt and a black tie. His name tag identified him as Carlos, the restaurant manager. Are you the manager? Richard asked, pleased that someone with authority had finally arrived. I am Carlos, the general manager, the man replied calmly. I understand there has been some concern about your service tonight. Can you tell me what the problem is? Richard launched into a long complaint about Maya's supposed failures. He listed every criticism he had made during the evening, exaggerating each problem and making it sound worse than it actually was. As he spoke, Carlos listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Maya with what looked like understanding. I see, Carlos said when Richard finished his rant. These are serious concerns. Maya is usually one of our most professional servers, so I am surprised to hear about these issues. Well, you should not be surprised, Richard said smugly. It is obvious to anyone with experience that this girl is not cut out for this kind of work. She lacks the maturity and skills necessary for fine dining service. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate you bringing these concerns to my attention. However, before we discuss any consequences, I think there might be someone else you should speak with about this situation. What do you mean? Richard asked, confused. I think, Carlos said with a small smile, that you should speak directly with the owner of this restaurant. Would you be willing to do that? Richard's eyes lit up with excitement. This was exactly what he wanted, a chance to speak with someone at the top level who could take serious action against Maya. Absolutely, Richard said confidently. I would very much like to speak with the owner. It is time someone in authority heard about the problems with your staff. Carlos nodded and looked toward Maya, who was standing quietly nearby. Maya, he said, I think it is time. Maya looked back at Carlos and nodded. She took a deep breath and stepped forward toward Richard's table. The moment that would change everything was about to arrive, and Richard had no idea what was coming. Carlos, the general manager, stood calmly beside Richard's table. His expression was professional, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more about this situation than Richard realized. The restaurant had become very quiet, with most customers now watching the drama unfold at the corner table. I want to make sure I understand your concerns completely, Carlos said to Richard. You feel that Maya has provided poor service throughout your evening here? That is correct, Richard replied confidently. He was pleased that the manager was taking his complaints seriously. From the moment we arrived, this young woman has shown that she lacks the basic skills needed for this job. Carlos nodded and pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. Can you give me specific examples of what went wrong tonight? Richard was happy to repeat his complaints in even more detail. He told Carlos about the wait at the front door, the bourbon that he claimed was watered down, and the lobster that he insisted was overcooked. He complained about Maya's age and experience, suggesting that she was not mature enough to handle important customers. She clearly does not understand the level of service that people like us expect, Richard said, gesturing toward his fellow judges. I have eaten at the finest restaurants all over the country, and I know quality service when I see it. This girl simply does not measure up. Carlos continued taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification on certain points. The other judges watched this interaction with growing discomfort. They could see that Richard was exaggerating many of his complaints and being unfair to Maya. "I see," Carlos said when Richard finished. "And what would you like me to do about this situation?" "I want her fired," Richard said bluntly. "Someone who cannot do their job properly should not be working in a restaurant of this caliber. You need to send a message that poor performance will not be tolerated." A few customers at nearby tables gasped at Richard's harsh demand. Judge Harrison looked mortified by his colleague's behavior. Even Judge Martinez, who had been quiet most of the evening, looked shocked at Richard's cruelty. Carlos raised his eyebrows. "You want Maya to be fired? That is quite a serious consequence. Are you certain that her performance tonight warrants such drastic action?" "Absolutely," Richard replied without hesitation. "I am doing you a favor by bringing this to your attention. If you do not take action now, other customers will leave negative reviews, and your restaurant's reputation will suffer." Maya stood nearby, listening to this conversation with a mixture of sadness and anger. She had worked hard all evening to provide good service, despite Richard's constant criticism and rude behavior. Now this man was trying to get her fired simply because he enjoyed making her miserable. Carlos looked thoughtfully at Richard. "You know, Judge Pemberton, I have been managing restaurants for over 20 years. In that time, I have learned to recognize the difference between legitimate complaints and unreasonable demands." "What is that supposed to mean?" Richard asked, his voice becoming defensive. "It means," Carlos replied calmly, "that I have watched Maya work tonight, and I have also watched your behavior. From where I stand, she has provided excellent service while maintaining her professionalism despite being treated quite poorly." Richard's face began to turn red with anger. "Are you suggesting that I am lying about the poor service we received?" "I am suggesting," Carlos said carefully, "that perhaps your expectations are unrealistic, and your treatment of our staff has been inappropriate." The other judges looked relieved that someone was finally standing up to Richard's bullying behavior. Judge Thompson nodded approvingly at Carlos's words. "How dare you?" Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the restaurant. "I am a respected judge with years of experience dealing with people. I know inappropriate behavior when I see it, and this girl has been unprofessional all evening." Carlos remained calm despite Richard's outburst. "Your Honor, I have great respect for your position and your accomplishments. However, in my restaurant, I expect all customers to treat our staff with basic respect and courtesy." "I have been perfectly reasonable," Richard protested. "I simply have high standards and expect them to be met. Screaming at our servers and demanding that they be fired is not reasonable," Carlos replied firmly. "It is bullying, and I will not allow it in my establishment." Richard was shocked. He was not used to being confronted or challenged. In his courtroom, no one dared to speak to him this way. His authority was absolute, and people followed his orders without question. "I want to speak to the owner," Richard demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "I want to file a complaint about your unprofessional attitude as well as hers." Carlos smiled slightly. "As I mentioned earlier, I think speaking with the owner is an excellent idea. I believe that conversation will be very enlightening for everyone involved." "Good," Richard said, trying to regain his composure. "I want someone in charge to hear about the terrible experience I have had here tonight. Both you and that girl need to face consequences for your behavior." Carlos nodded toward Maya, who had been standing quietly during this exchange. "Maya, I think it is time to have that conversation with Judge Pemberton." Maya took a step forward and looked directly at Richard. For the first time all evening, she was not smiling her professional smile. Her expression was serious and confident. "Your Honor," Maya said in a clear, strong voice, "I would be happy to discuss your concerns about this restaurant and its service." Richard looked confused. "I do not want to discuss anything with you. I want to speak with the owner, not some waitress who cannot do her job properly." Maya reached behind her back and slowly untied her server's apron. She folded it carefully and handed it to Carlos. Then she straightened her shoulders and looked Richard directly in the eye. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I am Maya Johnson, and I am the owner of Magnolia's restaurant." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard's mouth fell open in shock. The other judges stared in amazement. Customers at nearby tables began to whisper excitedly as they realized what had just happened. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, horrified realization. The young woman he had been belittling and trying to get fired was actually the person in charge of the entire restaurant. "That is impossible," Richard stammered. "You are just a waitress. You cannot be the owner." Maya smiled for the first time since their conversation began, but it was not the same friendly smile she had worn while serving their table. This smile was confident and knowing. "I assure you, Your Honor," Maya said calmly, "I am exactly who I say I am, and we need to have a very serious conversation about your behavior in my restaurant tonight." The silence in the restaurant was complete. Every conversation had stopped. Every fork had been set down. All eyes were focused on the corner table where Richard sat frozen in shock, staring at Maya with his mouth hanging open. I do not understand," Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said you were a waitress. You were serving our table. How can you be the owner?" Maya remained standing, her posture straight and confident. The nervous young woman who had been trying to please Richard all evening was gone. In her place stood someone who clearly belonged in a position of authority. "I never said I was just a waitress," Maya replied calmly. "You assumed that was all I was based on seeing me serve your table. But I serve tables regularly because I believe in staying connected to every aspect of my business." Richard's fellow judges were watching this scene with amazement. Judge Harrison was the first to recover from his shock. He stood up slowly and extended his hand toward Maya. "Ms. Johnson," he said respectfully, "I owe you an apology for my colleague's behavior tonight. Your service was excellent, and you handled an impossible situation with remarkable grace." Maya shook his hand with a genuine smile. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. I appreciate your kindness." Judge Martinez and Judge Thompson also stood to shake Maya's hand and apologize for Richard's conduct. They looked embarrassed and ashamed of how their colleague had acted. Richard remained seated, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. He was trying to process what was happening, but his mind could not accept this reality. How could this young black woman possibly own such an expensive restaurant? "This has to be some kind of mistake," Richard said weakly. "You are too young to own a business like this. And you were working as a server." "I am 26 years old," Maya said firmly. "And I have been the owner of Magnolia's for 3 years. I worked my way through college and law school by waiting tables at restaurants just like this one." Richard's eyes widened when she mentioned law school. "Law school? You went to law school?" "I graduated from Columbia Law School 2 years ago," Maya replied. "I passed the bar exam on my first try, but I decided that running my own business was more appealing than practicing law." The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone in the restaurant. Here was Richard, a judge who was supposed to be wise and fair, being taught a lesson by a young lawyer who had chosen to follow her entrepreneurial dreams. Carlos, who had been watching this exchange with satisfaction, stepped forward. Maya worked her way through 8 years of college and law school by serving tables. She saved every penny she could, and when she graduated, she used her savings to open this restaurant. "That is impossible," Richard said, though his voice lacked conviction. Someone her age could not possibly have saved enough money to buy a restaurant. Maya looked around the dining room of her restaurant with obvious pride. "I did not buy this restaurant, Your Honor. I started it from nothing. I found this empty building 3 years ago, negotiated the lease myself, designed the interior, hired the staff, and created the menu. Every detail of this place came from my vision and my hard work." Richard was struggling to understand how everything he believed about Maya could be so wrong. "But you were serving tables tonight. Why would an owner do that kind of work?" "Because I believe that every job in this restaurant is important," Maya explained. "I work in the kitchen sometimes, I serve tables regularly, and I even clean bathrooms when necessary. How can I expect my employees to take pride in their work if I am not willing to do the same jobs myself?" Judge Thompson nodded approvingly. "That shows real leadership and character." Maya continued, "I also serve tables because it keeps me connected to our customers. I want to know what people think of our food and service. Tonight, for example, I learned a lot about how some people treat service workers when they think those workers have no power." Richard felt the weight of her words and the stares of everyone around him. He was beginning to realize that his behavior had been witnessed not just by a young waitress but by a successful business owner and lawyer. "But why did you not tell me who you were?" Richard asked desperately. "If I had known you owned this place, I would have treated you differently." Maya's expression became serious. That is exactly the problem, Your Honor. You should treat every person with respect regardless of their position or what you think their position is. A person's worth is not determined by their job title. The other customers in the restaurant began to applaud Maya's words. Some people stood up and clapped louder. Richard could see that everyone in the room was supporting Maya and condemning his behavior. I made a mistake, Richard said quietly, though he was still struggling to accept the full extent of his error. Yes, you did, Maya agreed. You made many mistakes tonight. You assumed that because I am young and black and was serving your table, that I must be uneducated and incompetent. You treated me with disrespect and cruelty. You tried to get me fired from my own restaurant. Richard's face was burning with shame and embarrassment. He had never been so humiliated in his entire life. I am sorry. I did not know. You did not know because you did not bother to see me as a complete person, Maya interrupted. You saw only what you expected to see based on your prejudices and assumptions. Judge Harrison looked at his colleague with disappointment. Richard, as judges, we are supposed to evaluate people based on facts and evidence, not on assumptions and stereotypes. Tonight you have failed to live up to the standards of our profession. Carlos stepped forward again. Maya, how would you like to handle this situation? Judge Pemberton has been extremely disruptive and disrespectful to you and our other customers. Maya looked thoughtfully at Richard, who was sitting slumped in his chair like a man who had been defeated. She could see that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. I think, Maya said slowly, that Judge Pemberton and I need to have a private conversation. But first, I want to address our other customers who had to witness this unpleasant scene. Maya turned toward the rest of the restaurant and spoke in a clear voice that everyone could hear. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that your evening was disrupted by this incident. I want you to know that Magnolia's is committed to treating every person with dignity and respect, and we expect the same from our customers. The restaurant erupted in applause again. Several customers called out words of support for Maya. One elderly woman shouted, "Good for you, dear." Others nodded and smiled their approval. Maya then turned back to Richard, who was now looking at her with a mixture of fear and shame. Your Honor, I think it is time for us to have a very serious discussion about what happened here tonight and what it means. Maya pulled out a chair and sat down across from Richard at his table. Her fellow judges had moved to give them some privacy, but they remained close enough to hear the conversation. The rest of the restaurant had resumed their meals, though many people continued to glance over at their table with curiosity. Your Honor, Maya began, her voice calm but firm, I want you to understand exactly who I am and what you have done tonight. Richard looked up at her with red, embarrassed eyes. He appeared much smaller now than he had when the evening began. His confidence and arrogance had completely disappeared. I told you I went to law school, Maya continued. What I did not mention is that I graduated third in my class. I received offers from some of the most prestigious law firms in New York City. I could have started my career making more money in 1 year than many people make in 5. Richard listened in stunned silence. Each word Maya spoke made his behavior seem worse and worse, but I had a different dream, Maya said. I wanted to create something of my own. During all those years of working in restaurants to pay for school, I fell in love with the hospitality industry. I loved making people happy with good food and excellent service. She gestured around the beautiful restaurant. So I took a huge risk. I turned down those law firm jobs and used every penny I had saved to open this place. My family thought I was crazy. My professors could not understand why I would give up such a promising legal career. Richard was beginning to realize that he had not just insulted a waitress, he had insulted someone whose accomplishments far exceeded his own at the same age. The first year was incredibly difficult, Maya continued. I worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. I did every job in this restaurant, cooking, cleaning, serving, managing. There were times when I thought I might fail and lose everything. She paused and looked around her restaurant with obvious pride. But we survived that first year and then we began to thrive. Word spread about our food and service. Food critics started writing positive reviews. We began winning awards. Maya pulled out her phone and showed Richard a recent newspaper article. Last month, Magnolia's was named one of the top 10 restaurants in the city. The review specifically praised our commitment to excellent service and our welcoming atmosphere. Richard glanced at the article and felt even more ashamed. Here was proof that Maya had built something truly special, and he had treated her like she was worthless. I still work tables regularly, Maya explained, because I never want to forget what it feels like to serve customers. I want to make sure we maintain the same high standards that made us successful. She leaned forward and looked directly into Richard's eyes. Tonight, Your Honor, you taught me something very important about human nature. You showed me how quickly some people will judge and mistreat others based on nothing more than assumptions and prejudice. Richard tried to speak, but Maya held up her hand to stop him. Let me finish, she said. You assume that because I am a young black woman working as a server, I must be uneducated, incompetent, and somehow less worthy of respect than you are. You never bothered to learn anything about me as a person. Maya's voice became stronger as she continued. You treated me with cruelty and contempt. You tried to humiliate me in front of your colleagues and other customers. You demanded that I be fired from my own restaurant. Richard's hands were shaking as he listened to this summary of his behavior. Hearing it all laid out so clearly made him realize how terrible he had been. But here is what really bothers me, Maya said, her voice filled with emotion. You said that you would have treated me differently if you had known I was the owner. That tells me that you do not believe all people deserve basic respect and kindness. She stood up and looked down at Richard with disappointment. A person's job does not determine their worth. The young man washing dishes in our kitchen deserves the same courtesy as a judge. The woman cleaning tables deserves the same respect as a lawyer. Other customers in the restaurant had stopped eating to listen to Maya's powerful words. Some were nodding in agreement and a few were wiping tears from their eyes. Your Honor, Maya continued, as a judge you hold a position of great responsibility. People trust you to be fair and wise, to see past surface appearances and judge people based on facts and character. Richard looked up at her with shame and regret written across his face, and tonight you failed completely in that responsibility, Maya said firmly. You allowed your prejudices to blind you to the truth. You treated another human being with cruelty, based on nothing more than your assumptions about what she was worth. Judge Harrison, who had been listening from a nearby table, approached them. Maya is absolutely right, Richard. Your behavior tonight has been disgraceful. You have embarrassed yourself, your colleagues, and the entire judicial system. Judge Martinez and Judge Thompson also returned to express their agreement. We are ashamed to be associated with your conduct tonight, Judge Thompson said quietly. Richard finally found his voice. I'm so sorry. I made terrible mistakes tonight. I let my assumptions and prejudices control my behavior, and I treated you horribly. Maya studied his face carefully. She could see that his apology was genuine, but she also knew that words alone were not enough to undo the damage he had caused. Your Honor, she said thoughtfully, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that this is not just about one evening or one person. Your behavior tonight reflects attitudes that cause real harm to people every day. She sat back down and leaned forward earnestly. How many times have you made similar assumptions about people who appeared before you in court? How many defendants have you judged harshly because of their age, race, or appearance? Richard's face went white as he realized the implications of her questions. How many times had he allowed his biases to influence his decisions as a judge? I want you to think about that, Maya said seriously. I want you to consider how your prejudices might have affected your ability to provide fair and equal justice. The weight of Maya's words settled over Richard like a heavy blanket. He was beginning to understand that this evening was about much more than restaurant service. It was about fundamental questions of human dignity, respect, and justice. Maya stood up again and looked at Richard with a mixture of sadness and hope. Your Honor, what happens next is up to you. You can dismiss tonight as an unfortunate misunderstanding, or you can use it as an opportunity to examine your attitudes and become a better person. Richard looked up at this remarkable young woman who had just taught him the most important lesson of his life. He knew that he would never forget this evening, and he hoped that he would have the courage to change. Richard sat in silence for several long minutes, staring down at his hands. The restaurant around him had returned to normal, with customers enjoying their meals and conversations. But at his table, the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. Finally, Richard looked up at Maya with tears in his eyes. Ms. Johnson, he said quietly, I do not know how to begin to make up for my behavior tonight. I have been a judge for 15 years, and I always believed I was a fair and honorable man. Tonight you have shown me that I was wrong, Maya sat back down across from him. Despite everything he had put her through, she could see that Richard was genuinely affected by what had happened. She believed in giving people chances to grow and change. "Your Honor," she said gently, "I do not expect you to change overnight. Prejudices and assumptions that have been built up over a lifetime do not disappear in a single evening. But I do hope you will take this experience seriously and use it to become more aware of your biases." Richard nodded slowly. "You are right. I need to examine how I have been thinking and acting, not just tonight but throughout my career. I am afraid of what I might discover about myself." Judge Harrison, who had been waiting nearby, approached their table again. "Richard, I think we should leave now and let Maya get back to running her restaurant. But before we go, I want to say something." He turned to Maya with respect and admiration. "Ms. Johnson, the way you handled this situation tonight shows incredible maturity and wisdom. You could have had Richard thrown out of your restaurant. You could have embarrassed him even more than he had already embarrassed himself. Instead, you chose to teach him a valuable lesson with dignity and grace." Maya smiled warmly. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, even when they make serious mistakes." Judge Martinez and Judge Thompson also expressed their admiration for Maya's handling of the situation. They apologized once more for their colleagues' behavior and promised that they would help Richard understand the seriousness of what had happened. As the three judges prepared to leave, Richard stood up slowly. He looked at Maya with genuine remorse and respect. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to know that tonight has changed me. I will never forget the lesson you taught me, and I promise to spend the rest of my career trying to be the kind of judge you deserve to have in our legal system." Maya stood and extended her hand to Richard. "I believe you mean that, Your Honor, and I hope you will follow through on that promise." Richard shook her hand firmly. "May I ask you something? Why did you choose to forgive me tonight? After the way I treated you, you would have been justified in having me banned from your restaurant." Maya thought for a moment before answering. "Because I believe that people can change when they are given the opportunity to see their mistakes clearly. Tonight you saw yourself through the eyes of someone you had hurt and dismissed. That kind of self-awareness is the first step toward becoming a better person." She paused and smiled slightly. "Besides, as someone who studied law, I believe in justice. But I also believe in mercy and redemption. Everyone deserves a second chance to do better." Richard felt a lump in his throat. This young woman had shown him more grace and wisdom than he deserved. "Thank you," he said simply. "I will not waste this second chance." After the judges left, Maya walked around her restaurant, checking on customers and making sure everyone was enjoying their evening. The staff looked at her with even more admiration than before. They had always respected her as their boss, but tonight they had seen her handle an impossible situation with incredible skill and grace. Carlos approached Maya as she finished speaking with a table of regular customers. "That was amazing," he said with a proud smile. "I have never seen anyone handle a difficult situation so well. You turned a terrible evening into a teaching moment." Maya sighed with relief. "I am just glad it is over. For a while there, I thought I might lose my temper and say something I would regret." "You never even came close," Carlos assured her. "You were professional and dignified throughout the entire ordeal. That man learned a lesson tonight that he will never forget." As the evening wound down and the last customers finished their meals, Maya reflected on what had happened. She felt emotionally drained, but also proud of how she had handled the situation. She had stood up for herself and her staff while still maintaining her values of respect and compassion. 3 weeks later, Maya was working in her office when Carlos brought her an envelope that had been delivered by hand. Inside was a letter from Judge Richard Pemberton, along with a check for $5,000. The letter read, "Dear Ms. Johnson, I have spent the past 3 weeks thinking about our encounter at your restaurant. I have examined my behavior not just that night but throughout my career as a judge. I am ashamed to say that I have found many instances where my prejudices may have affected my decisions and treatment of others. I have enrolled in sensitivity training and bias awareness courses. I have also begun working with a diversity consultant to help me understand how unconscious prejudices can influence judicial decisions. This is just the beginning of the work I need to do to become the kind of judge our justice system requires. The enclosed check is a donation to any scholarship fund or educational program you support. I know it cannot undo the harm I caused, but I hope it can help other young people achieve their dreams, despite the barriers and prejudices they may face. Thank you for teaching me the most important lesson of my life. I will spend the rest of my career trying to live up to the example you set that night. With deep respect and gratitude, Judge Richard Pemberton. Maya set down the letter and smiled. She walked to her desk drawer and pulled out information about the scholarship fund she had established to help restaurant workers pursue higher education. Richard's donation would help several young people achieve their goals. She looked around her beautiful restaurant and felt grateful for the journey that had brought her here. The road had not been easy, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But she also knew that she had the strength and wisdom to handle whatever came her way. That evening, as Maya served tables and chatted with customers, she thought about the power of second chances and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. She had learned that sometimes the best way to fight prejudice was not with anger, but with grace, wisdom, and the courage to see the potential for good in every person. The story of that night spread throughout the city, becoming a powerful reminder that assumptions based on appearance can blind us to the truth about others. Maya's restaurant became even more successful, not just because of the food and service, but because people knew it was a place where every person was valued and respected. And Judge Richard Pemberton kept his promise. He spent the rest of his career working to ensure that justice was truly blind to race, age, and social status. The lesson he learned from a young restaurant owner changed not just his life, but the lives of countless people who appeared before his court. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected encounters, and the greatest teachers are found in the most surprising places.